Appreciate it. Grace and peace to you from God our Father and from the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. So, I want to begin today with a little story. Some of you I've gotten to know over the past year here at CTK, and others I haven't had the opportunity yet. But I'm very excited to meet all of you once this is over and we're all back in this building. But to know just a little bit about me, I was raised in the heart of the South in lovely Charlotte, North Carolina, where my parents instilled in my brother and I Southern manners and Southern hospitality. We were always told at a young age to say, please, thank you, yes sir, no ma'am, and above all else, to always say Mr. and Mrs. when we were talking to an adult. Our parents instilled these rules in us from a young age, and there was one time that my brother and I were leaving youth group and our dad was driving, and on the way home we decided to take one of my friends back, and my dad was pulling up to his house, and as he got there he said, "Tyler, is this the house?" And he said, "Yes, thank you, Bobby," and proceeded to leave the car, and immediately there was just this awkward silence that encompassed the car. But my dad, being the man that he was, didn't say anything, said goodbye to him. And as my friend walked through his front door of the house, my dad turns around and reminds us, "Remember what you say to adults." And we said, "Yes, always call someone by Mr. and Mrs." And at the time it was a little bit scary because I felt that my dad was calling out my friend and reminding us of how we needed to act to adults. Today, I'd like to begin with reading Romans chapter 6, verses 12 and 13, that says, "Therefore, do not let sin exercise dominion in your mortal bodies to make you obey their passions. No longer present your members to sin as instruments of wickedness, but present yourselves to God as those who have been brought from death to life, and present your members to God as instruments of righteousness." So I'm in seminary right now, about a year, and we're going to kind of dive into the Greek and the Hebrew this morning. And in particular, I want to look at the word instruments. Because when we look at the Greek and Hebrew, it's not a musical instrument that Paul is referring to. And it's not a subtle, calm conversation. The same word for instruments is weapons of war and armor. Paul is telling the Romans and the readers of this passage to gear up, to put on your weaponry and your armor and get ready for this war against sin. And today in particular, I want to talk to you all about two things. One is slavery to the law, and the other one is slavery to righteousness. So looking into slavery of the law, what is the law that Paul is referring to? Well, many of us in Lutheran Church are familiar with the Ten Commandments from our confirmation, but there are also 613 other laws in Deuteronomy and Leviticus. And basically, these laws told the ancient Israelites what they needed to do or what they had to do in order to receive sanctification and righteousness from God. We see an example in Deuteronomy chapter 28. "If you fully obey the Lord your God and carefully follow all of his commandments." Look at the particular words here that are highlighted. If, fully, carefully. The ancient Israelites are walking a very small tightrope when it comes to appeasing God through the law. No wonder that these people felt like slaves, because if they ever messed up or couldn't fulfill the law, they were being called out by God or their surrounding community. And then the second half of this phrase, we just looked at law, let's take a look at slavery. And I realize that this is a very difficult word right now, especially with everything going on in our world and community. But right now in this context, I want to look at the Old Testament side of this. What does it mean to be a slave back then? Well, slavery in Old Testament times, a slave was only there for 6 years. And in the 7th year, we see in Deuteronomy that they were freed And not only that, but their master gave them possessions to go out and live their own life as a freed person. This happened in 7-year increments. And there's a very special day that's written in Leviticus called the Year of Jubilee. And so we just talked about slavery was in 7 years. So imagine 7 of those. 7 times 7 is 49. So in the 50th year, you had this joyous occasion called the Year of Jubilee. And basically what this was is slaves, everybody, all your debts were paid and you were free. It was a chance for you to start over. And actually in the New Testament, in Luke chapter 4, where Jesus begins his ministry, he actually talks about the year of Jubilee, saying in verse 19, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. That year is the year of Jubilee. And just because this was written in the Old Testament law, it doesn't actually mean that the ancient Israelites or the Hebrew people actually followed it. In fact, there's no secular writings that talk about this year of Jubilee ever existing in history. Paul references this because he's trying to illustrate to the audience that we don't live up to the law. Paul is calling out these followers of the old law. And then in verse 19, Paul continues on and talks about slavery to righteousness, saying, for just as you once presented your members as slaves to impurity and to greater and greater iniquity, so now present your members as slaves to righteousness for sanctification. And if you're like me, you might read this and be a little bit confused because there's a paradox going on here. Why was Paul just talking about slaves to the law and now is saying we're free but as slaves to righteousness? That doesn't make any sense. And to do that and understand it further, I got to pull the seminary card again, and we got to go into the Greek and not what the English translation is. The Greek word for this is doulos, which means 2 things. One, as we just saw, slaves. But the second word is very interesting. It's servant, a servant to righteousness. And as servants, we have freedom to follow the law as we choose. And this freedom comes from grace and grace alone. For you see, we are servants of righteousness by what God has done and not from our own accord. And in verse 15, Paul actually says, what then should we sin because we are not under law but under grace? This is right after he establishes that we are servants of righteousness because of grace. There's no gray area for Paul in this. He says, by no means. We follow the law not because we have to anymore, but because of grace, we follow the law because we want to. The 10 Commandments and the 613 laws that were established in the Old Testament have been flipped. The ancient Israelites followed these laws in order to be saved. And because of what Paul was saying, we have now been saved, and therefore we follow the law because we want to. God is calling us out of the grip of the law simply by grace. And for Paul, there is a choice that can be made. You can either be a slave to law, or you can be a servant, that's the word I choose, of righteousness. You have a choice. You can be a slave to the law and be like the ancient Israelites who were freed from the captivity of the Egyptians in slavery. And Moses brought them out into the wilderness, and even still, those people turned to Moses and said, we miss our life of slavery. Take us back. They wanted to continue that cycle and didn't realize it. Or you can be a servant of righteousness and be like the woman in John chapter 8. The woman who committed adultery. And while according to the law, yes, she may have messed up. And yes, she might not have fulfilled what was required out of the law. But as she was about to be stoned by the people, Jesus comes in, casts out the crowd, and says to the woman, "Daughter, you are forgiven by grace. Now, because of this, go out and live the law." Do you see where it's been flipped now? We are either called out by the law, or we are being called out from the law. Our world is in this constant cycle of slavery to sin. If you have any sort of social media account right now, I guarantee that you're seeing what's going on in our world, and particularly in our country, where they are tearing down statues that signify oppression against those of slavery, white supremacy, and all of these horrible things. And I love that there is this community rally for this. But right now, there seems to be this notion that because these statues are down, we're finished. Oppression is over. And that's not the case. We are not done yet. While we tear down these statues, we still participate in institutional racism without even realizing it. We sing songs supporting only white Christian artists and completely neglecting artists of color and of different cultures than our own. We subtly racially profile people, whether it's our coworkers, our neighbors, or someone walking down the street, and we don't even realize it. We are all guilty of sin and still choose this cycle. We try to pretend that we're better than them, better than him, better than her. We continually go back to a slavery of sin. And we want to make this world right. But we're not done yet. We're so quick to judge those 200 and 300 years ago. But I can't help but think, 1,000 years from now, what will people say to us? Looking at what we've done and say, yes, they nailed down one or two of these things and fixed it. Good for them. But look at the 20 things that they missed in their blind spot along the way. We need to look at the whole story and think. Or, instead of living in this world of sin, we can live a life as servants to righteousness. Now is the time to show this love and freedom that we have been given by grace. I mean, couldn't the world use a little more servility? I like to think of it as the difference is that as we are slaves to sin, we work toward the law to fulfill its requirements. But through grace, that requirement is fulfilled, and the law becomes how we should live our lives instead of what we need to do in order to be saved. Circling back to my story earlier, I can't help but look back at what my dad said to my brother and I. My dad called out my friend for saying his first name, and originally it was scary, but now that I look back at it, my dad wasn't rebuking my friend or calling him out harshly, but he was showing my brother and I that the world is a better place when we follow instructions. Through forgiveness, he was calling out what my friend said and told us that we say these things. We say yes, ma'am, no, sir, Mr. and Mrs., not because we have to, but because we want to as a sign of respect. So my final question for you all today is, in what way are you being called out? Are you being called out as a slave to the law and the world in this constant cycle? Or are you being called out of that law as a freed servant to righteousness? Amen.